So it's 7:01. I'll get us started and people may filter in as I talk. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Robert Steele and I'm a professor here in the Department of Philosophy at UNO. And I'm also a member of the Medical Humanities Faculty. It is with pleasure that I can welcome you here to the fourth and final event in our new Ethics of Medicine lecture series here at UNO. In this series, every last Thursday of the month at 7 p.m. Central, yours truly has been here moderating an hour-long Zoom event featuring a scholar in medical ethics, applying their cutting-edge research to pressing contemporary problems. Now, putting together a series is a bit of an undertaking, and when it comes to this one, there are lots of people to thank, but I'd like to specifically thank the Ted Kooser Health Humanities Center for their financial support, as well as Courtney Kovitz of the College of Arts and Sciences for her invaluable work in building our web presence and advertising and really getting this whole event to actually run. So for this, our final lecture, I'm very excited and honored that we have Dr. Dana Howard here to present to us. Dr. Howard is an assistant professor at the Ohio State University Center for Bioethics, College of Medicine. Previously, she received her Ph.D. in philosophy from Brown and held a position as a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center. Tonight, she will be joining us to present some recent work she's been doing on testimonial justice in the context of reproductive decision-making. So for this event, the chat function is disabled, so you will not be able to use the chat, but we are going to be taking questions through the Q&A. So you can put those questions in whenever you like as they occur to you, as the talk is ongoing. But then once the presentation is over, we'll break for a Q&A session. I will probably kick things off with a couple questions of my own. It's my privilege as the moderator, but after that, I'll move on to questions from the queue. So we really do encourage you to pipe up and share your thoughts in the Q&A. Please do. And with that being said, I think there's no reason for me to take up any more of your time. And instead, I will turn things over to Dr. Howard.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steele, and thank you for the philosophy department and for the Ted Kooser Center for Health and Humanities. I'm so excited to be here, and I welcome any questions that you have. Please reach out to me. So let me share my screen. So hopefully you could see this. I'm giving away some stuff. All right. So hi, everyone. So today, the title of my talk is Putting Parents on a Pedestal, Testimony, Admiration, and Reproductive Decision-Making. And I guess the way to enter into some of these questions are main philosophical questions that sort of motivate my project. So often when we think that someone is being disrespectful or treating you unfairly, especially a case of epistemic injustice, which I'll get to in a second, often it's because they pity you or they look down upon you or something like that. And one trend or theme that I've seen often talked about in sort of in this disability, like the parents of parents within the disability rights movement, is also this possibility that admiration can in itself be a form of disrespect. And I don't exactly know how to cash it out, but this is my attempt for this talk. So the main theoretical questions that I'm thinking about are, can admiration be a form of disrespect? And can it be a form of epistemic injustice? Most of what my talk is going to be about is the sort of disrespectful angle. And then I'm going to sort of end with the sort of questions about epistemic injustice. All right. All right, so to get us started, let me give you some a taste of some of the arguments that I've seen parents of children with intellectual disabilities make on blogs and in memoirs and in philosophical writing. So this is from Stacey Lewis. She has a child with an intellectual disability. So she says, So this was from the Mother Lode, and it was actually embedded in a discussion around Down syndrome, but Stacey Lewis's child does not have Down syndrome. So she says, people are under the mistaken belief that as the parent of a disabled child, I deserve admiration. Some amazingly even tell me that I'm a better person than they are. So am I more devoted, more loving, more ambitious than other parents? The reality is I am no different than you, dear reader. I am no different, and that must be very frightening. I did not do anything to deserve a disabled baby. I did not do anything to be rewarded with her. I had a normal pregnancy. I took excellent care of myself. It happened to me. The truth is it can happen to you. And in an op-ed in 2018, Chris Kaposi, who is a bioethicist and a philosopher, he wrote an op-ed entitled "The Ethical Case of Having a Baby with Down Syndrome." So he says, while my wife and I are pro-choice and oppose placing limits like the current Ohio law on abortion related to Down syndrome, nonetheless, I wish more people would include children with Down syndrome in their families. For this to happen, we don't need new laws, we just need more people to choose to have such children. Having a baby with Down syndrome may seem too demanding to some prospective parents. It may seem that those of us who choose to have children with Down syndrome are either irresponsible or saintly. From my experience, however, such parents tend to be utterly normal and level-headed people. And what I take from both of these cases is this sort of theme that there's a lot going on, but one of the themes is we're normal, we're not special, like don't look down on us, don't pity us, but also don't admire us. And that's sort of the structure of the, or that's like the theme that I'm going to be thinking about today. And so Chris Kaposi also published a book, Choosing Down Syndrome, Ethics and New Prenatal Testing Technologies, that is great, really interesting. And part of what I'm going to do to think about these questions is to work in a sort of critical way with some of the arguments that he makes in his book. So one way we could sort of think about the kind of potentially disrespectful argument that these two testimonies are trying to push back against is an argument that is in this form. So the first premise is basically a kind of admiration, right? So good parenting of kids with intellectual disabilities requires an exceptional amount of patience, grace, humor, moral fortitude. Maybe you want to add flexibility, whatever positive qualities you want, you could put in there. So there's this admiring of parents who have kids with intellectual disabilities. The second premise is a self-reflection about yourself. And you could look at your own traits, your own amount of patience and grace, and you could say, I am not exceptional in this way. And then the conclusion is, I wouldn't be a good parent for such a kid. And this is the kind of argument that I think that, I know that at least Chris Kaposi is sort of trying to push it back against. I don't exactly know if, that's the case with all of these testimonies. And that's the kind of argument that I want to see if there's anything potentially disrespectful about. Okay. And so one of the interesting things that Chris Kaposi does in Choosing Down Syndrome is he adds a lot of parental testimony. And he talks about the importance of giving due respect to that testimony of children with Down syndrome, of parents of children with Down syndrome. But then the question is, well, what does giving due respect entail? So I think the answer to this question is potentially more complicated than the one that Kaposi in his book indicates. And this is because, and this is sort of me foreshadowing what we're going to be talking about, one can take the parent's testimony at their word. That is, one can hold that it's in fact the case that bringing up their particular child with Down syndrome has been of immeasurable value and has made a positive impact on their lives and on the lives of their other particular children and on their friends and family. But at the same time, one can have all that and believe and trust all that, but not believe that such testimony is generalizable to other people who are facing similar circumstances and decisions. And in theory, I think this is completely coherent to, on the one hand, believe that the parental testimony is reliable, and then on the other hand, that to take such testimony as not relevant to your own position. So I don't think that there's anything incoherent about that. But the question is it ethically appropriate and is it epistemically appropriate? And those are the sorts of questions that I want to explore in the talk today. So in the intro of Kaposi's book, he sort of says that he's going to include a lot of these parental testimonies, and then he explains why. So he says the arguments presented here are often about the experience of parenting children with Down syndrome. When it comes to discussions about what such experiences are like, parents of children with Down syndrome are actually in a privileged epistemic position. Rather than assuming such parents are not objective, we should instead listen to them. So what does due respect to such parents and their testimony entail, and what does it mean to really listen to them? So Miranda Fricker in Epistemic Injustice makes this, what I take to be a pretty important distinction between treating someone as an informant and treating someone as a source of information. So let's say this is Barb. She says, I'm cold. I treat her as an informant when I believe her on her say-so, and I'm like, oh, she's cold. I better give her a blanket or something. I treat her as a source of information when I see her shivering or, like going, right? And so I look at her, and rather than on her say-so, I come to believe that she is cold through her behaviors, through my perception of her behaviors. Now, there's nothing essentially disrespectful about treating someone as a source of information, according to Miranda Fricker. But there is something disrespectful about treating people merely as sources of information, especially if they're trying to be informants. So what does this mean when it comes to families and parents of children with Down syndrome or children with intellectual disabilities? So there are ways we could treat them as informants without necessarily just reading their testimonies or memoirs or op-eds, right? So we could just look at the data and we could look at the self-reporting of these families and of these parents. And so when we look at the data, we see that there's equal levels of marital satisfaction, there's equal levels of parental stress, and there's equal levels of pride and love in comparison to parents of children without intellectual disabilities, right? So we could look at this data. They're saying we're happy. We can trust it. We could treat them as informants. We could also look at external measures, right? So rather than asking them how they feel about their situation, we could look at the divorce rate levels. So the divorce rate is actually lower than the national average or comparison groups. And we could also look at observational studies of family cohesion, which show that there are similar levels of family cohesion when you have social scientists just sort of observing familial behavior. Now, one thing to highlight is that doesn't mean that everything's perfect. There's, I'm a mother of a 4.5-year-old during the pandemic. There's sometimes some family non-cohesion, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any more or less than someone who's parenting a child with Down syndrome. All right. So when you look at the source, when you look at these external measures, you're treating these families and these parents as sources of information. So you look at the data and then you determine they're happy, not on their say-so, but on their behaviors. And I think that it's important to do both when it comes to trying to get as much data as we can about the welfare metrics of these families. But it's also especially important to treat them as informants. And the reason is giving due credence to the empirical data about the objective measures of well-being treats parents of children with Down syndrome and parents with other intellectually disabled children as sources of information. So we can believe the evidence, but we engage with these families and their perspectives from a third-personal, quasi-touristic point of view. On the other hand, when we give due credence to these parents' own testimony, we're treating them as informants from a second personal perspective. We're honoring their expertise and credibility as members of the same community of knowers. And we get to recognize them as part of the conversation, as people who should be consulted, who should be questioned, and who should be listened to directly. And that seems like an important feature of epistemic justice when it comes to these parents. All right. So what Miranda Fricker is trying to tease out different types of epistemic injustice. And so one way of sort of broadly defining epistemic injustice is treating someone unfairly in their capacity as a knower or in their capacity to describe their own experience. The thing that I want to focus on here in this talk is a subset of epistemic injustice, testimonial injustice, where the hearer takes a speaker's words less seriously. That is, they get less credibility or are treated as less authoritative because of some prejudice that the hearer has, even if that isn't deliberate, and even if the prejudice is all this process is implicit. It's not something that is happening intentionally. And so you could think about the slogan of what testimonial justice is it's prejudice-based credibility deficits. So, someone basically is not given the credibility, their words aren't taken as seriously because of some prejudice that we have. Now, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus mostly on what this credibility deficit really looks like. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about how I think it's prejudice-based. Okay. So what does it mean to really listen to parental testimonies? So there's two options. So one is that we should treat the testimony as reliable. That is, that it's not adaptive or a product of self-deception. Another way of thinking about it, the second option, is treat it as reliable, but also as informative to our own position. And Chris Kaposi focuses on the importance of treating this testimony as reliable in his book. So he says, some may question whether the testimony of parents of children with Down syndrome is reliable, whether the descriptions of family life are distorted by adaptive preference, which emphasizes positive views, but overlooks dysfunction. So let's look at what this adaptive preference means and how it could potentially be disrespectful to parents. So is parental testimony a result of adaptive preferences? So there's a huge literature about adaptive preferences, but like the way to really sort of think about it most broadly is when people end up preferring options that they would not have preferred had they found themselves in more optimal conditions, we may become aware of this fact and of how these preferences came about, and then we start questioning how informative these preferences really are. So that's sort of the way in which worries about adaptive preferences start challenging whether or not we should trust or take seriously the testimony of other people. So here's an example, a classic example of an adaptive preference. This is an adaptive preference change. So the fox desires to eat a bunch of grapes hanging from a tree, but eventually he realizes that they are too high for him to reach. Having discovered that he cannot get the grapes, he decides that he didn't really want them anyway. Grapes are too sour for foxes. So at first, he really wants those grapes, but then he realizes he can't have them. And that's when he decides that he actually never wanted them to begin with. Preferences can be adaptive, not in the way that they change, but in the way that they're formed. So here's another case, like the Stepford wives case. It could be a case of adaptive preferences. I think they ended up being like aliens or machines or something, but if they were humans, right? So a woman grows up in a deeply patriarchal society who forms preferences for submissive gender roles, shunning education, taking orders, and in some cases, even accepting abuse. So when we meet such characters, we tend to be suspicious of the reliability and evidential status of these preferences. We tend to not take what they say seriously. So the question is parental testimony a result of adaptive preferences in the same way? And Kaposi focuses in his book on oppression accounts of adaptive preferences. So here he says, well, what is what is wrong or what is going on that is like problematic about adaptive preferences? Well, it's when a preference is unreliably adaptive, and so we shouldn't take it seriously if it was formed under oppressive circumstances and or is inconsistent with the person's basic flourishing. And there's a bunch of different ways in which you can cash that out. Now, I think that this is an appropriate way to think about what is sort of going wrong with the Stepford wife case, but it's not necessarily what is going on wrong with either the parents or the fox, right? So the fox, there's no oppression that makes the grapes grow on vines that are a little bit too far up from the fox's grasp. And while there are, I think we do live in a ableist society, and there are many challenges for disabled people and for families with disabled children, ensuring that they have the right sort of needs for their kids. I don't think that the preferences are formed in such a way that we should disrespect them as being maladaptive. And I don't think that they're inconsistent with the family's basic flourishing. But I'm happy to be pushed on that in the Q&A. So Kaposi focuses on these suppression accounts, and I think he's right to say that there's no reason to think that we should not respect or trust parental testimony because they were a product of self-deception as a result of oppressive circumstances. But there are other ways of cashing out adaptive preferences that are more formal and less about oppression. So the classic case of adaptive preferences is John Elster. So John Elster was like the sort of first analytic philosopher to start talking about the aesop fable, the sour grapes fable. So he basically cashes out adaptive preferences, or what makes them unreliable, in the following way. A preference is unreliable or unreliably adaptive, and so we shouldn't take it seriously if it was subconsciously formed in response to a diminished set of feasible options. Such preferences in these circumstances are indistinguishable from accepting a suboptimal arrangement. So they end up being unreliable because they don't count as evidence that this is really what the person would have preferred if they had a larger set of options. Now, when it comes to the fox's case, that seems right. That's one way of thinking that the fox is holding on to some adaptive preferences. And maybe that's the same with parents of intellectually disabled kids, just as it is with all parents, right? So once you have a kid, your feasibility set of what your potential kid is much narrower, and then you form those preferences related to your attachment to your kid, right? So the answer is, well, maybe these are adaptive, but who cares, right? Maybe actually the oppression accounts get it right in when we should really take seriously the problem of adaptive preferences. And when it comes to the fox, or when it comes to the parents, we should just let them have their preferences, right? Why mistrust their own testimony? So one thing you could say is, well, we are wrong to be so dismissive of the fox's preferences. And we would be similarly wrong to be so dismissive of the retrospective testimony of the parents. Insofar as the fox's dislike for grapes doesn't harm him, who cares about the genealogy of his preferences? It's a patronizing and insulting, and it's insulting to question the reliability of the fox on his own tastes. And you could say something similar about the parents. Like, why should we care about how these preferences formed? It's patronizing and insulting to question the reliability of their testimony now. So I think that this is a fine response to the fox, given his preferences, but I think it's not an appropriate way to vindicate parental testimony. So that's what I say right there. The parents do not just take themselves to have adapted to their diminished circumstances. They take themselves to have learned something important from the experience of parenting a child with Down syndrome, something that they can share with others. So their retrospective attitudes are presented as ones of enlightenment, not of subconscious acquiescence. So unlike the fox, who's merely communicating personal preferences, the parents are trying to make a claim not only about the value that having a child with Down syndrome has had for them, but that parenting such a child can be rewarding for almost anybody. And so that's why I think that it's not enough to just treat parental testimony as reliable. We have to treat it as reliable and as informative in some way to one's own perspective. And cashing out what that means is it's a big project, but one part of it is, I think, refusing to pedestal them. So what does refusing to pedestal mean? Well, before I explain exactly what pedestaling is, it's helpful to make a distinction that R.J. Wallace makes between affirmation and justification. So to affirm something, according to Wallace, is to judge that it is valuable along some dimension or other, and also to prefer that on balance, taking everything into account, that it should not be otherwise. So that seems pretty close to justification. So what is the difference between affirmation and justification? So here's a case that Wallace gives. We could call it pre-lift, maybe also pre-COVID, since I don't know how many people, I guess now people are flying again, but anyway. So imagine that I promise to drive you to the airport so that you can fly for a job interview. At the last minute, I renege on my promise and make you miss your flight. The flight ends up crashing into the Atlantic and everyone on board dies. How are you supposed to feel about my actions? Now, R.J. Wallace thinks, of course you would affirm, right, the fact that you'd be glad of the fact that I ended up reneging on my promise, right? All things considered, you would not want it to be otherwise. But retrospective affirmation of how things turned out doesn't magically create justifications ex post facto, or justifications before things turned out the way that they do. So he's trying to make a distinction between affirmation and justification. And R.J. Wallace thinks that there are some lessons when it comes to disability that are related to affirmation and justification. He doesn't talk about parents of children with intellectual disabilities. He talks about people with disabilities more directly, but I think he might say the same sorts of things about parents. So this is what he says about disabled people. From the fact that such agents have good reason to affirm their own disabilities, however, it doesn't follow that the condition they affirm is generally a valuable one, something that in other contexts we have reason to promote or to encourage or to choose for people when there are alternatives available to them. And I think that one could make, or he would probably make, a similar sort of argument about the affirmative testimony of parenting a child with Down syndrome. So namely, he would say something like, there's nothing unreliable or self-deceptive about the parental testimony. The parents' love and value for their particular child is not only understandable, it's what is called for. However, the parents' reasonable affirmation doesn't amount to justification that they should have entered into the relationship in the first place. The deliberative situation between the parent writing the memoirs and the parent making the decision prospectively is different. So given this distinction between affirmation and attachment, we can imagine the following couple. And I want to say here that the reason why I choose this couple isn't because I think that there is anything actually important, there is any responsibility that the couple has that all of us have when it comes to the sort of way in which we're the audience for these kinds of testimony. It's just that this couple is in a deliberative position where they have to make a choice. And we are in the sort of, I mean, if we're not needing to make certain choices, we're in the position where we get to read a lot of testimonies and be like, huh, that's interesting, that's curious, right? But we don't have to actually act on those, on reading these testimonies, where it's harder, the couple in some ways is faced with the choice. Anyway, so that's sort of my qualification about why I choose this couple. All right, so imagine the following couple. They're pregnant and they're considering whether to continue a pregnancy with a fetus that tests positive for Down syndrome through NIPT. A friend of theirs suggests that they read gifts. Let's imagine that they've talked to their friends about the way that they're struggling with this decision, and the friend suggests that they read this book that they that is an anthology of 60 plus autobiographical narratives written by parents of children with Down syndrome. Upon reading these narratives, this couple is awed by the compassion, the humor, and the love that is emanating from these parents. They find no reason to doubt these affirmative accounts. They don't see any sort of reason to think that they're adaptive in any malicious or deceptive sort of way. But at the same time, the couple is skeptical about whether they would be able to exhibit such virtuous attitudes towards their own child were they to bring it into the world. They, in essence, are putting these parents who are writing these memoirs on a pedestal, and they fail to see how these affirmations provide for them any justification to continue with the pregnancy or to rethink their position in any particular way. Now imagine that this is a pushy friend, and we could talk about the ethics of pushing back in the Q&A, but imagine that the friend pushes back a bit and points to the many stories in which the parents seem to assume that their own response to the situation is just mundane and completely normal. But to this couple, when they get, this pushback, this assumption and part of these parents that are writing these memoirs, this is nothing is exceptional or this is completely normal, just provides further evidence of how special these parents writing the memoirs are. So the couple that are reading these memoirs cannot see themselves rising to the occasion because of the exceptionality that they see in the parents. And so the question is, well, is this a case of epistemic injustice? What I take to be problematic about the pedestaling perspective is that you could sort of trust and find reliable these parents' affirmation, but you don't see that as any sort of generalizable justification for how you should think about whatever decisions you meet before embarking on having a kid or not having a kid. Okay. So one can take the parental retrospective affirmations to be completely free from bias or self-deception and still be skeptical about whether such testimony is applicable to others who have yet to decide whether to enter into the parenting relationship with a child with Down syndrome in the first place. The parents are still seen as exceptional against their own telling of the story. Now, I want to sort of highlight what I take to be the sort of problematic feature of this kind of admiration. And that is that basically the couple, the imagined couple, or when people read the stories and don't see it as generalizable, or they don't really, they can't help but see these parents as exceptional, they're just not able to get rid of the admiration part. They're just not able to get rid of this idea that good parenting of kids with intellectual disabilities requires an exceptional amount of patience, grace, humor, and moral fortitude. This says nothing about their own sense of themselves, their own sense of whether or not they would rise to the occasion. It says nothing about how they're supposed to incorporate, if they read the testimonies and they no longer hold this admiration sort of view, it doesn't say anything exactly about how they're supposed to incorporate the testimonies into their own decision making. So the thing that I think is the sort of the credibility deficit is the fact that parents are trying to say that there's nothing special or exceptional about their experience, and their audience doesn't buy it. And so let me go back to testimonial injustice. So the idea is the hearer takes the speaker's words less seriously, i.e. less credible or as less authoritative because of some prejudice. And for most of this talk, I've been trying to tease out what in the red this credibility deficit really is. And I haven't really talked a lot about the prejudice. And I think it's really interesting to think about where the prejudice lies when it comes to these parents. And I don't think the prejudice lies with the parents. And in that way, I'm not sure if, like, at least on Miranda Fricker's definition of epistemic injustice, this counts as an epistemic injustice. Because I think the prejudice is against their children, or it's against disabled people, or more broadly, rather than against the parents. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think that that's interesting. And I recognize that there are, within the disability community, is a very heterogeneous community. And there's also really important questions about who speaks on behalf of whom. And often there is a tension between parents' testimony not necessarily being representative of their children. So I think that the sort of, insofar as this credibility deficit is a case of epistemic injustice, it's because of the prejudice against the children or disabled people, rather than against the parents. Anyway, that's where I will end it. There are more. I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I would love to hear Professor Steele's questions and also questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
This is a reminder that the Q&A is open, and we would love to hear any and all questions that you have. They will be curated by me. I'll get us started. First, just a quick clarificatory question. So I understood you then near the end of saying, to be clear, you think that getting rid of the pedestal perspective does not entail, for a set of prospective parents, making either actual decision with respect to whether they want to continue their pregnancy or not.
Yes. Yeah. I should make that really clear. I mean, so for one, it says nothing about the second premise, which is about your own position. And everyone is going to be an authority about their own position and what they're willing to do and what they can do, and also what support systems are available for them. And so I just think that you can completely trust, give full credibility to parents' testimonies, and still make a decision to not continue the pregnancy or to continue the pregnancy. And so it doesn't exactly bear on that. And so, I mean, I think that the reason why I choose, and I said this a little bit, but it is very important. I mean, I think that these are really hard questions, I guess, and it's really hard to figure out precisely how to think about what respect requires, but at the same time also realize that there's not only stigma related to disability, there's also stigma related to abortion and reproductive decisions. And so, I mean, there's a lot going on with these sorts of decisions. And one of the things that I really like about Miranda Fricker's account of epistemic injustice is that it's a virtue-based account rather than sort of an account of blameworthiness. So insofar as you're engaged in some kind of epistemic injustice, like not giving people the credit that they're due, there are certain things you can do to try and become a better listener, right? And take people seriously. But those things are how to become sort of virtuous. And part of the things is like, how to create a sort of community where we don't have these inequalities in whose voices get heard and who gets to be counted as authoritative. So I think on Fricker's account, it's not this individual responsibility. It is sort of a collective responsibility that we have. And so even there, I think that even if parents or prospective parents are making these decisions, the responsible thing to do may not be at all related to their particular reproductive decision. It might be much more related to, you know, how they talk and think about disability more broadly.
And so, in the way you're thinking about the sort of the reasons you have to cultivate that kind of virtue to improve yourself as a listener and acceptor of testimony is the connection to injustice. And I was sort of curious about that. Maybe this is just like my past life as an epistemologist showing, but there was part of me that thought, okay, well, once you've shown me that like the subjective measures of well-being for parents with disabled children are as good or better, the objective measures of indicators that we might think, you know, non-self-report based, so we don't have to even trust them, but we can just say, hey, they're not getting divorced or whatever. If those are the same, and so you hence, looking at all of this evidence, I can see none that actually points towards them enjoying a lower quality of life or family. There was some part of me that was like, oh, now I'm ready to stop because you've just convinced me that what I used to think about this matter was wrong. Mm-hmm. But then there's this other piece, which it's like, it's not just that it's wrong, it's that it's sourced in injustice. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, I guess, how much that adds and also how necessary that is. Like, what if we went around not believing these parents, but for reasons that had nothing to, their credibility deficit we put on them just didn't have to do with injustice, because maybe I just literally don't trust anyone when they talk about their quality of life because I have an overall more paranoid worldview where I'm like, people are just, they're all lying, they're all in their own heads or whatever. You can't trust them. Would that be okay then?
Or maybe you just don't trust parents, right?
Yeah,
and they're like, you're like, oh, parents again talking glowingly about their children. It's like, gag me with the spoon, right? Yeah, so I think that, so I am very live to the possibility that this is not an instance of epistemic injustice. But I do want to say that I do think that one of the things that I didn't talk about in the talk, but is relevant, I think, to the story, a lot of these narratives are narratives about transformations, personal transformations. So the narratives aren't like, I am just like, this is hilarious thing happened, right? The narratives are just like, first, I had this very normie view of like what it meant to succeed in our society, and it was the white picket fence and like the kids going to prom and then to college and, you know, all that stuff. And then they're like, and then I had this kid and it turned everything upside down and blah, blah, blah. And then it's like, and these were the challenges. And then these were the like triumphs and this funny story happened. So that's like the arc, right? And so I think that the arc is important because part of what it's doing is it's supposed to, I mean, I don't know, it's the supposed to there is like not like intentional, but like part of what I take this kind of narrative arc to be doing is it's supposed to make us question our own priorities and values, given that we haven't had these experiences. And so it's supposed to give us reason to second guess our own intuitions, right? That finds the sort of more objective metrics surprising. And it's supposed to give more credence to the sort of self-reporting, because these are people that have had the sort of experiences that we think make them experts in whether or not, like the welfare metrics of having a child with an intellectual disability. And so I think that there's a way in which you don't even need the testimony to believe these facts. But what the testimony does is it makes your beliefs less fragile, and it could potentially make it more deliberatively salient, where it makes it more important in the way in which you think about your own situation.
This is actually This is an excellent segue into a question from the Q&A. A lovely question we have here, our first Q&A question from the audience. So the question goes, there is something weird about who the I in the conclusion is. I wouldn't be a good parent to such a child, but maybe would I become a good parent in the sort of transformative experience way? The parents of Down syndrome children don't know more about me with my current preferences than I do, but might know more about who I would be after having such a child. But I prefer my current preferences. Maybe I would come to prefer other preferences if I had such a child, but right now I don't have the preferences. So the I who I am now would not be a good parent to such a child, goes the question.
I think that is exactly right. So I think that that's right. And that's why, I mean, it's like, the title of the talk is, what was it? It was about reproductive decisions. And it's like, that's a little bit of like a red flag. I mean, I think that it's really, but I think that this question is exactly right. So there is, I think, a real puzzle here about how to take seriously testimonies that include these transformative experiences. One of the puzzles is, well, why would I want to discover who I would become, right? So that's sort of like the practical salience of these testimonies. But I think the other puzzle is, I mean, in some ways, so it's like, so this is a little bit half-baked, but the testimony is we are not exceptional, right? But the narrative is, well, we had these like very normal beliefs about like what constitutes, that are like part of the hegemonic like ableist society about what constitutes a successful life. And then we became a minoritized family in this very specific way. And we got this like, we got access to these other experiences that lots of people don't have access to. And in some ways that is a little bit exceptional, right? Like, so the exceptionality isn't about the virtue, but it is potentially about the way in which their values have been reprioritized. And I do think that we live in a society where it's hard to have those values. Like, it's hard, like you're constantly going to be battling against people who are going to take pity on you or your children or your family in this way that is very frustrating. So there's always going to be this sort of bump. Anyway, but I think that is the question really brings up a lot of really interesting, I think, philosophical puzzles about like, well, what would true listening and incorporating it into your deliberative perspective actually require, if anything?
I think so this maybe actually helps with understanding the relevance of injustice, because with what you just said and with the question, I'm starting to feel like you have to bring injustice into the picture to get some sort of answer to why I should care about the person I would be after I was transformed. In the way that, so I might say, look, I'm giving full testimonial credit to these parents because I genuinely believe that they weren't exceptional. They have happy lives. If the same thing happened to me, I would be transformed and I would have a happy life. I believe that. I just don't want to be transformed that way. I don't care. I'm not into it. In the same way that, like, I could believe, like, some people are really into Scotch. That's never been my thing. And they're like, oh, there are all these magical notes and you can like train your palate and eventually you'll love licking the swamp or whatever the Scotch people believe. And I could fully believe that, like, yeah, if I drank Scotch, you know, in the evening every day for a few months and read tasting guides and stuff, I could get to the point where I like did really love Scotch. I just don't see any reason why I would do that. And it's like, it seems like maybe what we need is for there to be a positive reason for you to do that that comes from dealing with injustice that has to do with the fact that in one case we're talking about parenting disabled children, which maybe has like positive ethical social value for the country, the world, yourself. Whereas in the other case, it's this thing that's totally neutral, Scotch. There is no reason to transform yourself into a person who loves Scotch. That's like fully optional. And I don't know. I just I rambled on for a bit. I don't know if...
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. So two things. One is, I think that the justice component is important. And the reason why I think it's important and it's related to the exceptionality case is related to how we see the challenges that the parents face, whether we see the challenges that the parents, when the parents succeed and we see them as exceptional, that means that there's some sort of natural burdens or natural challenges. We naturalize the like challenges that they face, raising kids with certain disabilities, right? So the exceptionality makes for a different view of where the problem is. And it becomes less of a collective problem that we have to solve together and more of personal, familial problems that these families who are exceptional get to like work out because they're so virtuous. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that there is a relationship between justice and these perspectives. But given the first question from the audience, I still am a little bit cautious about calling it a case of epistemic injustice. I think some of these perspectival like barriers or seeing people as exceptional are just sort of, they make you like not good potential agents of solidarity in political movements or something like that. And that's just practical injustice, right? That's just like, you're just being a bad co-citizen with them. And so I do think that there's a little bit of a puzzle still about whether or not this really is epistemic in any way, rather than just sort of plain old fashioned, like you're not open to the ways in which we need to work together to make this a more inclusive and accommodating world for everybody.
Okay. Yeah, no, here I'm again bouncing something off you, and apologies to people in the Q&A. Ha ha ha, this is why I get to be moderator. So another reason to think that maybe actually an injustice component is necessary in the analysis here. So what if I was like, all this talk about believing or not believing, it's so binary. Again, my closet epistemologist is coming out and I'm like, well, you should never be certain of anything and you should never be certain that anything's false. You just become more or less confident. And that's the appropriate way to think about everything in the world. Certain of nothing. There's always at least a 1 in a trillion chance that something's not going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. And then I might think, I'm really investing credibility in these parents, but credibility is still never 100%. Mm-hmm. It would be inappropriate to claim you're morally required to believe someone 100% because it's intellectually wrong to believe anything 100%. And so morality probably doesn't require you to be a dummy. That would be a weird conclusion. So I believe them, and I believe them like 99%, but that still leaves 1% left on my prior evaluation where I thought that having a disabled child with, say, Down syndrome would be very challenging and difficult and everything for me. So I'm like, 99% it's fine, 1% it's not fine. But also choosing not to have a child with Down syndrome, it's like, then it's 100% what my chance of what I was prior looking at. There's no introduced 1% chance that something's going to be really catastrophic. Right. And so like, maybe that is a reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so two things. So one is, that's why I've been, so I think that I should be careful when I talk, not about believing propositions or believing what people say, but giving them like the credit, the credence level that they deserve. So the sort of the credence deficit. So it's like, you should believe these parents just as much as you believe other parents, basically. Like that's sort of the idea. And so it's like, 30% wishful thinking and like just attachment to the cute, like the cuteness that is their like little brat. And then 70% is like, oh, they actually have like good experiences like that, like suggest that they are experts at this. So that's one thing to say. The other thing to say, and this is very new, so I don't know if this is right, but I just read Rachel Fraser's recent paper, Narrative Testimony. And so there, one of the things that she's talking about is epistemologists are focused, like usually when they talk about what it means to trust or what it means to accept testimony, they're thinking about accepting like a proposition, right? Proposition, the sentence, the fact, right? Accepting the one fact. And that's not how most testimony is done. Most of the things we do is tell stories, or we present testimony in these narrative forms. And so she really is talking about, there's, you know, this sort of simple testimony acceptance. And then there's this sort of deeper coordination where you're accepting narrative testimony is accepting the way it was represented, accepting the sort of story, the like how it's interpreted, what is salient about it. So it's representational structure. So I think that that's sort of the thing that I'm thinking about. It's less about believing facts about the welfare and more about taking seriously their stories as pointing to the ethically significant features of the world.
But I'm not, well, I'm going to grill your brain about this one later. But really quickly before we end, because we do have a stop at 8, another question from the Q&A. Might this mean that to know ourselves sufficiently or know the things we want to judge, we must think about ourselves having different experiences or preferences? Even if things do not turn out that way, perhaps it gives us some perspective and humility about our present values and our judgment of others. An example is, should we weigh in on policy issues like euthanasia if we have not considered the alternative values we might have if we had more limited physical capabilities?
I think that's a really excellent question. It's something that I've been struggling with a lot, thinking about. So I've written about transformative decisions and transformative experiences within the medical realm, especially. And it's just hard to think about how to take the possibility of these sorts of transformations of who you are and what it's like, what it's going to be like to be you, seriously. And so one of the things that I think humility is super important, but one of the things that I think is also helpful is to pay attention to the emotional responses that people have after they've undergone the experience. So you might not understand why someone regrets a decision, right, that you don't think would be regrettable. But if a big majority of people find it regrettable, now this isn't going to help us with euthanasia, but if a big majority of decisions, so this happens with like chemo sometimes. So there's ways in which we could, there are some effective sort of projections that might really help us sort of take a step back and see if there's any values that currently aren't salient to us because we've just been so focused on the pain or we've been so focused on whatever. And so I think that is, just taking seriously the possibility that we could change does require a lot of epistemic humility. And for us bioethicists and philosophers, it requires us to think a lot more about conceptual like technologies, how to help people think through these decisions that are hard.
What a reasonable and helpful thing for us to work on. Maybe we should get around to it.
Maybe.
Not to be glib, but it is 7:59. We are coming up on our end time. I would like to thank the members of the audience for attending. And I would also like all of them, we won't be able to see them, but we can see me showing my appreciation to you, Dr. Howard, for coming to join us and share this exciting research with us. For any of you, many people registered who were not in attendance. They will get a link to watch the recording later, and so too will you, people who are here now. You will get a link probably sometime tomorrow. So thank you everyone for joining. It's been grand, and the end. I don't know, Dan, do you want to?
That's the end of the semester, everybody.
Okay. Cheers. Night, everyone.
Bye.